Hello, fellow crafters. We are going to make Kokedamas today. My name is Brittany Bly. I'm the founder of Pop Shop America. If you like all things gardening and all things crafts, this is the perfect DIY. This is so fun to make, so easy, and it's stunning. Here are the supplies you need to get started. So first of all, we have some fresh herbs. Right here I've got oregano, I've got peppermint, and I've got basil. Now I'm going to use the peppermint for this project because I think it's the easiest of the three. Next, I have a small amount of peat moss, and I also have bonsai soil. I also have water here. You're going to need tons of water for this project. I have sheet moss right here. I've got scissors, and then you'll also need some kind of twine. You can use lots of different types of twine depending on what your style is. A twine like this is going to show really distinctly. So if you want it to be very visible, then you're going to want to consider something like this. If you want something that's going to blend in with the moss that becomes invisible, I would recommend something that's clear, or even use a cotton twine that's black, and that's going to be great for this project. So just from beginning to end, everything that we're going to do today to make this kokedama, what we're going to do is we're first going to make a mud ball with these two different types of soil. So I'm going to add a lot of water. I'm going to squish it in between my hands until we can form a tight ball. We're going to squeeze out any excess water. Then I'm going to put the plant inside of it. We're going to completely cover the roots with the soil. Then last, we're going to attach the sheet moss to the outside using the twine, and it's completely done. From there, we can hang it anywhere. You can set it on a table. It's going to be amazing and so much fun. So let's go ahead and make it. So for step one in making a kokedama, I'm going to take this bonsai soil. I'm going to take more than what I need and add it to my container in front of me, just because when you add more than what you need, it's just a little bit easier to work with. Just makes it kind of fun. If you find any debris in there that's too big for your kokedama, you can just pull it out. So I have some twigs in mine. Now bonsai soil is really interesting because it stays really dry. It's quite rocky, it has pumice in it, it also has a small amount of sand. So it's great for anything that we want to keep nice and dry. Peat moss, on the other hand, is something that retains a lot of moisture. So what we're doing is we're creating a really great balance between keeping the roots of the plant nice and moist and allowing them to dry out. So we really want the best of both of these types of soil. So I'm going to add a lot of water to this. Now what we want is we want to be able to form a tight ball, probably a little bit bigger than this. So right now this is the size of a baseball. And I'm going to want something that's kind of in softball territory. Now we want for this to be squeezed and any excess water to come out, but we want it to be moist enough that pieces of the soil are not coming off. Now additionally, you might have noticed that I used almost all bonsai soil with just a small amount of peat moss. That's definitely our goal for this. We can also add a small amount of clay, which is perfect if you're having a hard time keeping the soil together. Once we get it to the size that we're comfortable with, the easiest thing to do is just to split it right in half. Now you'll see some people that actually use their thumb to dig out a small hole. That's definitely how it's done traditionally, but I don't think that's the easiest way. Our next step, while we still have really messy hands, is we're going to pull out our plant. I'm actually going to do it on top of my used bonsai soil. I'm just squeezing the container, turning it upside down. I'm going to put the container off to the side, and now I'm going to gently pull all of the soil away from the roots. Now I don't want to damage the roots when I'm doing this, but anytime I'm replanting anything, whether it's a kokedama, whether it's a terrarium, anything at all, I always want to pull the soil away from the roots to help the roots to breathe and to get them acclimated to their new environment. It's okay if there's a little bit of tearing, that's totally normal, but what we don't want is to damage the roots too much. That's of course how the plant gets its water, so we want to keep those as healthy as possible. I think that's about as good as it's going to get. I can already smell that fresh mint in there. Now I'm actually, if you see, I'm folding the roots up just to make them a little bit smaller, a little bit tighter, because it's going to make it easier to go inside of this mud ball that we've created for our kokedama. Now I take both halves of my mud ball, make sure that my mint is exposed, and now I'm just going to squish it together. Now you might notice that your perfect ball has now become more of a potato. That's totally okay. You're going to want to spend just a little bit of time squeezing those two halves together. Make sure all of your leaves are on the outside of the soil ball, the mud ball, and just keep squeezing until the two halves hold together. Now take a look at how I'm actually pretty firm with the way that I'm squeezing out the excess water and really helping this mud ball hold together. And now we're pretty much done with that step. We're ready to add the exterior sheet moss and make more of a gorgeous finished piece. So let's just set this down and make sure we prep our sheet moss. So before I get started with the next step, I'm actually going to rinse my hands. I'm going to be working with this sheet moss now, and we definitely want to keep this a clean environment. We're not going to be touching the soil too much more, so you can go ahead and just take a quick break, wash them off, and come back. Now that we're ready to wrap the exterior of the mud ball to make our kokedama, let's just slide this sheet moss in front of us. So this sheet moss is living moss. We never want to use artificial moss for this project, and we always need to prep it by just allowing it to soak in water for a short amount of time until it gets nice and moist throughout. Now I'm going to turn this piece upside down because this is going to become the exterior, the part that's very beautiful and green, and then the back side here, which is kind of the brown side, is going to be our interior. Now this is sheet moss. The best type of moss to use for this project is sphagnum moss, and that's because it retains water really well. Now I'm going to take just a quick second. Do you see these spots right here that are still just a little bit dry? I'm going to actually moisten them a little bit more because it's going to make it so much easier to work with. So I can definitely see on the back that it needs just a little bit more moisture. So we take our water and just get it a little bit wet. I just used a few tablespoons. And you can even squeeze the moss just to blend the dry parts with the water. And we're going to set our mud ball with our herb inside of it. And you can just play around with it, just kind of get a sense of how it's all going to fit together. I'm going to use the exterior line of the moss up at the top of the plant. So I have my plant in the very center. So I just want to kind of get a sense of how everything is going to fix together, how it's going to hold. And if I need to cut any of this sheet moss before I start attaching it. And it looks like I will have a little bit of excess, but I'm actually going to tie it all up first before I start trimming, because that's just going to give me a little bit more control over the final shape. Now I want something that's completely invisible. So I'm going to use this clear thread right here, but like I said, you could use so many different colors, you could use a lot of different styles, and the first thing I'm going to do is just a short length. This piece is just a few feet long, and I'm going to tie up the top of it around the leaves of the plant. So it doesn't need to be too perfect. Again, we are going to trim this just a little bit, and we can just start anywhere you feel comfortable. Put your hand underneath one section of the twine and start to pull that twine around in a circle up by the leaves of the plant. Now, my kokedama is going to be very potato shaped at this point. It's absolutely okay because we're going to keep forming the shape as we go. And we're going to squeeze out the excess water as we go too, so don't worry about your kokedama being really heavy right now. Anytime you get your kokedama wet, it's going to be much heavier, and then as it dries out, it's going to become much lighter. And that's actually a really great way to know when you need to water your kokedama. So you're going to become very aware of this as you're building it out. Now, one thing you can't really see because I'm doing this towards me is I'm just knotting that string together. We just want to tie a simple knot. We're going to use so much string that you don't need to worry too much about your knotting techniques. You can use any kind of knot that you feel comfortable with because we are going to use a lot of twine. So I have my first piece there. Now let's take a look at that shape. Now you see I've got some water that's dripping out, and I've got a fun little potato shape. So let's just take our hands, get in there, squeeze out some more of that excess water, and we're going to start to form it into more of a circle. So see how I'm just physically altering the shape with my hands. Any place that starts to pucker, I just squeeze it a little bit more. And more water's coming out, and that's perfect. That's just what we want. Now, once we're a little bit more comfortable with the shape, it's a little bit more of a circle. We've squeezed out most of that excess water. We want to start wrapping more twine around it. Now, you could use a second color if you like. You can use any color of the rainbow. I'm going to slide the rest of my sheet moss into the center, and now I've created a surface that's a little bit drier, so I don't have to keep squeezing it as I go. So I have a little bit of soil on my hands, still a little bit messy, but no big deal. And if you like, you can just keep your twine on the container itself. You don't have to cut lengths because we're just going to go around and around. We're going to make a million twists and turns and circles. I'm starting by just creating a knot. I'm knotting it to my first piece of twine. You can use any kind of knot, a balloon knot, a square knot, anything that works for you, because we're going to make so many knots. You don't have to worry too much, so many loops. And now we just want to go in every direction. We can even go through the plant a little bit. Just make sure you don't pull any of its leaves. So right here, we just want to lift it back up, go around in a circle. This twine is actually the thing that's pretty much going to hold the moss ball together, your kokedama together. So you're going to want to make a lot of loops. So you might have noticed that I talked about sphagnum moss for the outside of the kokedama, but I used peat moss on the inside. Now the peat moss is a type of soil. It's a very similar type of supply. The peat moss has been broken down over an extended period of time, whereas the sphagnum moss is more whole, but they're very, very similar gardening supplies that you'll use. So it's often that you'll see them intertwined or people mix them up, but we are using peat moss for the inside and sphagnum moss or sheet moss for the outside. So you might notice with this mint that the plant is kind of hanging, or it's like the leaves are going in lots of different directions. And that's really normal for mint because it's such a viney, windy, crawling herb. Now, as we put it in the sun, it's definitely going to start to grow towards the sun, and we want to consider turning it so that each side gets equal amounts of sun. It's going to make our herb grow a lot more evenly and just look really pretty. But you definitely want to make sure that all of your leaves are facing upward and that they're not hanging out of every side of your kokedama. So the types of plants that make really great kokedamas are plants that are going to do better in lower light or medium light environments. So that's why we're using herbs that are great for partial sun. We don't want to use herbs that require full sun So for example, I'm not going to make a kokedama out of lavender. I'm not going to make a kokedama out of chamomile because those require full sun. Now, the reason that we don't want to use a plant that requires full sun is a couple of different reasons. One is that the sheet moss that we're using prefers a slightly shadier environment. It doesn't do well in full sun. It gets burnt, it dries out, it actually changes color, it turns much more brown. So a lot of people just don't think it looks quite as cute. But additionally, we've created, this cool little environment with our soil, and it can be a bit of a challenge if we use a full sun plant because we're definitely going to need to pay closer attention to its watering and make sure that it's not getting too dry on the inside. Bonsai soil is very dry soil. We added a small amount of peat moss to help this retain more moisture. We've also added moss to the outside, which helps retain moisture. But what we don't want to do is create an environment that's difficult for it to stay moist. So full sun, plants that require a ton of light are not quite as great. So plants that you do want to consider are ferns, any kind of, bamboo works really well. Plants that like water do really well. So like this mint, for example, does really well. But we wouldn't want to use things like, for example, strawberries. I wouldn't recommend lavender. I would not recommend chamomile, for example. Now that we've made our kokedamas, let's talk about how we're going to display them and how we're going to care for them. So I could set this on a bowl if I like, something like this, and you can just keep it on a tabletop or anywhere you like. You can also turn it into a hanging object. All we need to do is take the same twine that we were using before. I would recommend cutting 3 long lengths, tie them on 3 opposing sides, and then tie them together at the top. Then just use a C-hook or something along those lines to hang it in a partially sunny environment, like a window. And that's where it's going to stay, basically. That's where it's going to live its life. It needs to be near a window. It needs to have partial sun, but again, we don't want to give it full sun. These are really great indoor plants. They're not going to be as easy to care for outdoors. When it's time to water them, we're going to know that it needs water because it's going to become a lot lighter. So again, that soil on the inside is going to retain a lot of weight anytime it's wet. So we're going to know the difference between a wet plant and dry plant. The amount of water, of course, is going to vary from plant to plant, but just talking about this mint that I've used, it's going to need a little bit more water than regular mint that's planted in a pot. The reason that it's going to need a little bit more water is because it's a little bit more of like a hanging plant, right? It's going to dry out because it's exposed on all sides and it's coated in that moss, and it doesn't have like a tray that's going to hold on to some excess water. So to water it, all we do is we just take it from its environment. We get a bowl of water just like this. We're going to set it in that bowl of water. We're going to leave it there for about 10 minutes. Then after that 10 minutes, lift it back up. We see that water that's draining away, and we're going to squeeze out any excess water. And just give it a squeeze. Once we have all of the excess water out, we can just put it back in its home where it can thrive. I hope you love making kokedamas. If you have any questions along the way, leave a comment below. I love solving craft conundrums. That's what I live for, so let me know what problems you run into when you're making these. My name is Brittany Bly. This is Pop Shop America. Like, subscribe, and ring the bell for more craft and gardening videos.